And then I love.
Yeah, we are recording it.
Okay, so right, these pop-ups, can create some diversion. But anyway, the points I will make is that northeast of India, geographically speaking, hangs on to the Indian mainland through a 22-kilometer wide Siliguri corridor, which is also called the Chicken Neck. So the situation of Northeast, geographically speaking, to the mainland is not as bad as was the case of East and West Pakistan, which were far apart. But there is a problem of strategic vulnerability. And this strategic vulnerability was brought to very sharp focus when two uprisings scarred the landscape of Northeast. First, it was the Naga uprising, the first ethnic rebellion in India or independent India, post colonial India. When the Nagas revolted, they took to weapons in quite some numbers, and they were backed by our good friends in Pakistan. In 1956-57, the Naga armed activity started in the Naga hills of what was then part of Assam. And in 1958, the first big batch of Naga rebels went to East Pakistan. It's all documented. There is no controversy over this. This is established fact. Led by Kaito Sema, something like 400 Nagas went to East Pakistan for training through the Bareil Ranges, which is on the tri-junction of Manipur, Nagaland, what is now Nagaland, and Assam. And cutting through these Bareil Ranges, Kaito took his fighters to East Pakistan. He entered East Pakistan from Sylhet, and they were trained there, and they were sent back. And the situation in Naga Hills immediately sort of heated up, and the fighting sort of spread all across the Naga Hills. So this was the first uprising, and the second uprising was that of the Mizos, when the Mizo National Front unleashed its Operation Jericho, as they called it, on the night of 28 February 1966. Unlike the Nagas, you can't give a definite date to the Naga uprising. It slowly built up. There were attacks here and there, and they multiplied. But the Mizo uprising has a date, February 28, 1966, when it all erupted all across the Mizo hills of what was then part of Assam. So both the Naga hills and the Mizo hills were part of Assam, the colonial province of Assam, and both sort of we witnessed revolts there. First one in 56 and then 56, 57, and then the Mizo revolt in 1966. And this actually created a serious situation, both for Nehru and then for Mrs. Indira Gandhi. When the Mizo uprising erupted, it was she who was the prime minister, unlike her father, who was the prime minister when the Naga uprising erupted. And I want to bring about this neighborhood factor now, the second factor. So the first factor was that the uprisings erupted and they exposed the strategic vulnerability of Northeast, India's Northeast. Because of its very thin linkage to the rest of the mainland, the Indian mainland, if you prefer to call it that way, um, and the strategic vulnerability was exposed. And it was doubled when a war erupted with China in 1962, because the Chinese, at the speed they entered the Indian territory of Arunachal and parts of Ladakh, they could well have threatened the Siliguri corridor, which they didn't do for reasons better known to them. Of course, and the very interesting thing is that they came all the way up to Tezpur in the plains of Assam. And then they retreated, very surprisingly. Now, a lot of people say they did that because they were getting unsure about their own logistics being stretched far too much. And they anticipated difficulty because their army had moved in far too fast for the logistics to keep up. And the Indian side of the border roads were not as good as on the other side. So, the Chinese were beginning to feel the pinch of logistics. There are a lot of logic, but a lot of people say they have a political intent. The fact is that the war with China exposed doubly the strategic vulnerability of the chicken neck or the Siliguri corridor and the difficulty of sort of keeping northeast in India, especially in view of the uprisings which had started. And there were other smaller uprisings in Manipur, where 1964 the first rebel group, the United Liberation National Liberation Front, by Anam Samarendra, was formed. In 1966-67, there was the Senkrak uprising in Tripura. So all across the northeast, what had started off in the Naga Hills was beginning to spread. And the feeling was that a lot of people in northeast, a lot of them, especially the ethnic indigenous tribes people, did not consider them to be Indian. There was a cultural gap, there was a psychological gap, and these are things that people know of. So I don't have to recount them in great details, but suffice it to say that the uprisings in the Naga Hills and the Mizo Hills, the stirrings in Manipur and Tripura, and of course the war with China, and of course the war with Pakistan as well in '65, exposed the strategic vulnerability of Northeast in a very, very clear manner. The second point I will make is that the Indian, and this is where the neighborhood comes in, the Indian effort in backing the Bengali uprising in East Pakistan when it erupted in full fury in the early 70s was very much linked to addressing India's own strategic vulnerability in the Northeast. And I will bring here something that I have written about in my last book, which is called Agartala Doctrine, published by the Oxford University Press. Feel free to read it. The first chief minister of Tripura, Sachindra Lal Singh, who came from a family of East Bengali revolutionaries, he was the uh, he was the nephew of the great Ananta Singh, one of the associates of Master Da Surjo Sen, the famous Chittagong uprising, where these people had freed Chittagong and kept it independent for 2 days, and then fought a running guerrilla battle against the British until Surjo Sen himself was caught and hanged, and most of the others were put in jail. Now, Ananta Singh's nephew was this gentleman, Sachindralal Singh, the first chief minister of Tripura, veteran congressman. He had actually hosted Sheikh Mujib in 1962. There's a date to it, 17 February, when Sheikh Mujib, the leader of the Bengalis in East movement in East Pakistan, the Bengali autonomy movement at that point of time, secretly came to Agartala and met with Sachin Singh. And Sachin Singh told me later that the first thing that Mujib told him as they embraced each other was, Dada, amra Bangalira ar Pakistane bodhoy thakte parbo na. So he told Sachin Singh, Dada, possibly we Bengalis in Pakistan can't live in Pakistan anymore. Sheikh Mujib was not a revolutionary on the mold of the great Bengali revolutions. He was not even a Subhash Chandra Bose, who had been in Congress and then had raised the INA. Sheikh Mujib was in the Muslim League and then formed the Awami Muslim League and finally the Awami League. And he had tried out his hand in the election politics of Pakistan. When Pakistan became a military ruled state, he tried his hands in political protest. And finally, by 1960s, as the leader of the Bengali autonomy movement, Sheikh Mujib had come to realize that Pakistan has become a military state, The Bengali Muslims, though they were the majority in East Pakistan, could not get justice in Pakistan. And this whole feeling of, Pakistan being the homeland of South Asian Muslims begin to fall apart. Because here we are talking of people who constituted nearly 60% of undivided Pakistan's population. Whenever they asked for their language rights, whenever they asked for their economic rights, as Sheikh Mujib famously said in his 7th March speech, 1971, 50 years ago, on the day he announced independence, Ebare Sangram Muktir Sangram, Shadinotar Sangram, that day he said very clearly, যতবার আমরা দাবি তুলেছি রাজপথে নেমেছি আমাদের রক্ত গঙ্গা বয়ে গেছে. Every time we have asked for our rights, our boys have been killed, our roads have been bloodied. So what I'm trying to impress on you is that Mujib and the Bengalis, the Awami League and the other leftist parties who were with him, by 1960s they had realized they had no future in Pakistan. But why did he come to Agartala? Because Mujib was a shrewd politician and he understood that if the Bengalis had to launch a secessionist struggle to get out of Pakistan, they needed Indian support. And the first place he touched base with are the people who had actually known him in the days of United Bengal. So he touched base with Sachindra Lal Singh. And when the Pakistanis sued Mujib, put him on the docks, the famous Agartala conspiracy case, without which the history of Bangladesh liberation is incomplete. It took the ISI 5 years to find out that Mujib had actually come to Agartala, so the case was filed in 67. And then, that is the time when Indira Gandhi realized, he called Sachindra Lal Singh and said, Singh ji, नागा हिल्स में पहले, अभी मीजो हिल्स में बगावत, हम इसको कैसे संभालेंगे? These rebellions are spreading across Northeast. How do we handle this? And this is where the neighborhood factor comes in. And I'm saying this to highlight this point. Is that Sachindra Lal Singh, in his very typical East Bengali style, told Mrs. Gandhi, "You're Thai court experts in Delhi. All these big experts in Delhi, kuch nahi janta hai. They know nothing. The simplest way to address your security concerns in Northeast is to kick Pakistan out of the East." That is his famous quote. He told me in his interview in 1986 that I told Mrs. Gandhi, kick Pakistan. So Mrs. Gandhi got up and said, "Kya bol rahe hain? East Pakistan to Pakistan hai." So Singh ji reminded Indira Gandhi, हाँ East Pakistan Pakistan है, but वो बंगालियों का मुल्क है और वो बगावत के लिए तैयार है. They are only waiting to figure out whether India is going to support them. So Mrs. Gandhi, being the shrewd politician that she was, and this is 1966 I'm talking about, said, आपका ताल्लुकात है मुजीब के साथ, अवामी लीग के साथ, आप ताल्लुकात रखिए, you keep your links with them open, and वक्त पर हमें जो करना है हम करेंगे. So the fact that India finally backed the Bengali struggle in 1971 and militarily intervened, the spade work has been done by Sachindra Lal Singh. He had managed to convince the leaders of Delhi, Indira Gandhi particularly, that the solution of India's security problems in Northeast lies in turning East Pakistan, a hostile place, into a friendly Bengali nation. A friendly Bengali nation. That's exactly what Sachindra Lal Singh faced. And then finally, the rest of the history. This is the 50th year of Bangladesh's independence, 50th year of India's intervention in Bangladesh. President Ramnath Kovind will be the chief guest on 16th December, the Bijoy Dibosh parade in Dhaka, big occasion. India does not celebrate this day with adequate pomp and splendor, as I would argue, because this was India's finest hour, military hour, and this comes 9 years after the humiliating defeat in 1962. So anyway, but besides the point, so this is the second point I'm making, is that the neighborhood, the eastern neighborhood of India's Northeast, Bangladesh on one side, Myanmar on the other, and China on top. This, the linkage between developments in these countries and Northeast have a direct bearing on how things shape up in the Northeast, how it impacts on Indian policies, and how it impacts on India's outlook as far as this strategic but sensitive region is concerned. This is point number two. The third observation I will like to make here is that insurgencies which which spread all across the Northeast at different points of time. The first phase was the 1950s, 60s Naga rebellion, Mizo rebellion. The second big phase was the 1980s when they spread to Assam, Ulfa, the formation of Ulfa in 1979. So, do you realize something that Assam, which was India's political subcontractor in the region, the Assamese elite who held up the Indian flag and ran northeast for India, with the reorganization of Northeast after India's military victory in 1971 in the creation of Bangladesh, Indira Gandhi went ahead with the reorganization of Northeast. Meghalaya became a full-fledged state. Tripura and Mizoram became full, they all were upgraded. Some became union territory, some became full-fledged state. And Assam was vivisected. The breakup of Assam, the colonial province of Assam, was affected by the Northeastern Reorganization Act because Mrs. Indira Gandhi realized, advised by some of our very brilliant advisors, she realized that Assam, the Assamese elite, had failed to run and meet the aspirations of the rest of the people of Northeast. So many of these tribal regions, they were carved out. Nagaland had already become a state in 1963, but Mizoram, Tripura and Manipur became full-fledged state. Mizoram became an union territory later. In Rajiv Gandhi's time, it was upgraded. So the reorganization of Northeast happened, and this was seen as an internal exercise to pacify the rebellions of Northeast. The external exercise being driving out Pakistan from the east, in keeping with the famous sort of vision of Sachin Lal Singh, which was accepted by Mrs. Indira Gandhi. So the point here that is very important to understand is that the insurgencies in Northeast have weakened. There is no doubt about that, but they have not quite gone away. The ambush of an Assam Rifles convoy a few days back in Manipur, in which a full colonel of the Indian Army with his wife and child and a couple of other soldiers of his, they were killed. So this drives home the point that insurgency has weakened. A lot of these insurgents are on the table. They're negotiating with the government of India. Some of the accords have been done, in the past. Some of the areas have quietened down, but the insurgency has not quite gone away. And here I refer to the Naga peace process, that while some of the previous accords, like the one in Mizoram in 1986, have been successful in holding the peace in those states, the Naga peace accord, for which negotiations started way back in 1997, still hanging fire. The framework agreement was signed by the Modi government in 2015, August. 6 Christmas has gone. 5 Christmas have passed by. We are very soon going to have the 6th Christmas since the framework agreement. But this framework agreement, which was supposed to pave the way for a final settlement of the long festering Naga rebellion, has not happened. And this drives home the point. 23 years you're negotiating on the table with the Nagas, and you still don't have a settlement. There's something seriously wrong with the way governments since 1997 have addressed this issue. This is a tricky problem, a difficult problem. It's not a straightforward problem like the Mizos, where you have a homogeneous nationality and you have a homogeneous organization in the shape of MNF, and you deal with the MNF, and that's it. The Naga movement is a splintered movement, it's a divided movement. The tribal divisions in Naga society are quite a serious thing. The Nagas feel themselves Nagas only when in reaction to India, but internally they are quite a divided people. I would argue that they are still a collection of tribe and not yet a nationality, um, in the sense that the Mizos are or some of the others are. Um, Go to Nagaland, you won't find a Naga paper. Yeah, language which is the cornerstone of the nationality, language which paved the way for the Bengali revolt in East Pakistan, starts with the language movement of 1952. All newspapers in Nagaland are published in English, for your kind information. So, you know, the Naga nationality formation process is still an incomplete process, and this plays into the politics of Nagaland and the problems that the Indian state faces in trying to settle the Naga imbroglio, which is the oldest ethnic rebellion faced by post colonial India. And therefore, one needs to understand, you know, the politics of both rebellion, the politics of insurgency on the one hand, and also the politics of peacemaking, and the pros and cons and the problems and the challenges that both sides face. The Nagas, believe me, including the insurgents, want peace, but they want peace with honor, as they say. The Indian state also wants peace for stabilizing the Northeast. How can there be Act East, as Mr. Modi famously says? How can there be this Act East push of India's foreign policy if Northeast remains disturbed? You can't be using a particular piece of territory to connect to your neighbors in the region, the tiger economies of Southeast Asia, through a region which is disturbed. It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be possible. And the best example is the long delay in taking the railway line from Silchar to Imphal. Why? Because contractors constantly complain that we have to pay off 6, 7, 8 rebel groups, and how can we finish the work? On the contrary, and this is the problem in Manipur, on the contrary, look at how Tripura sorted out the insurgency problem, and the railway line to Agartala was finished in record time. So, what I'm trying to say is, if you don't handle this political problems as political problems and tackle them with political settlements, you are not going to stabilize the law and order in Northeast. And in that case, this whole Act East through Northeast, which tries to situate the Northeast at the heart of our engagement with the neighbors, and some of them, you know, very strong economies.
Okay, sir, we have to
How are we going
now
to?
stop for the question answer. I think you have made your
Yeah,
points
yeah.
very
Just
well.
give me a second. Let
Okay,
me.
one minute, one
I'm
minute more.
almost finished with.
Okay.
I'm almost finished with this. So the last point I have to make here is that the present situation, the larger geopolitics, and how that's likely to impact the Northeast, our growing problems with China, our continued problem with Pakistan. Now, Pakistan does not exist in the East anymore, but their intelligence services are still active. Pakistan is very active in Bangladesh. They're determined to bring down, you know, the government of Sheikh Hasina, who is friendly to India and who is a secular government. And the Pakistanis have a problem with the Awami League because it's the Awami League which led their national liberation movement. But the Chinese now are also a factor. There are fears that if the Himalayan borders remain disputed and we fail to settle our borders with the Chinese, and the competition between the two Asian giants spills over into military conflict or quasi-military conflict, we are likely to have some kind of a Chinese, and possibly aided by Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, is a poor country now, And I'm told Pakistani intelligence officers are handing over their sources to the Chinese, including the insurgents. But this is the last point, Syed Sam, that we have to keep a very close watch on the larger geopolitics of Asia, our conflict with China, and how this could possibly reignite some of the dormant insurgencies. So that actually brings up the point that we better quickly negotiate a solution with the Nagas, because that's the mother of all insurgencies in Northeast. And if we manage to do that, it will have a salutary effect on some of the other smaller insurgencies. So high time we sorted out our house in order in the Northeast before the Chinese actually begin to look at these continued problems and reignite them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I mean, it was very well, I mean, presented. I mean, two things you have brought out: the problems in the Northeast and the challenges which India faces, and of course the neighborhood, the Bangladesh. I mean, which has now become a friendly, country, and which has facilitated our, engagement with the Northeast. But still, the problem of the Northeast stays as where it is. Maybe it has softened. It has not vanished. I have done a book called India's Eastward Thrust, Predicament and Prospects, where I have exactly argued the same argument which you have put forward, I mean, in my own way. And my first question, of course, there are so many people who would like to ask questions, but we just have about 9 to 10 minutes to close this program. The first question
You
is,
can extend the time if you have to. I don't have a problem because I don't have any engagement after this. So
no, I understand
if
this,
you
but
can,
this
if
format
it suits
will
you,
go off and we have to reassemble. That is again a problem. But we just quickly, I mean, because we have understood what you have said,
go
and
ahead,
we
go ahead.
just want to get feedback from you that how best we can, I mean, get into the Northeast and go further into Myanmar and go further into Southeast Asia. What is your prescription on this? That's my question.
Okay. Now I didn't talk about Myanmar at great length, but let me make this clear, taking this opportunity of this question, that Myanmar today, after Bhutan drove out the northeastern insurgents in 2004 and Bangladesh drove them out after 2009 when Sheikh Hasina came to power, she announced zero tolerance to terror. The only place where northeastern rebels have a foreign regrouping zone is the Sagaing province of Myanmar. The Myanmar army did, act against them because they wanted Indian army to act against the Arakan army, which was trying to get some base areas in Mizoram. But now, with Burma in absolute turmoil, the Burmese military is not just fighting ethnic rebels, which they've been fighting for ages. They have an urban Burmese insurgency developing because of their ruthless suppression. New rebel groups have come up within the Burmese community, and of course, the agitations are going on. Every day there is a strike, sometimes with the bank workers, sometimes with the railways. Burma is in absolute turmoil. Now, Syed Sahib, you're absolutely right. There can't be any look east or act east from northeast if Myanmar is in this kind of turmoil. There can't be anything if northeast is not settled, if we don't have these agreements that I talked about, the Naga solution and all that. But we can't also look east or act east if Myanmar remains in this kind of a problem. Now, here comes a very definite suggestion that I have been making for a while. The Americans and the Western countries can't intervene or mediate the conflict in Myanmar because the Burmese military does not trust them. The Burmese democracy movement does not trust the Chinese, so the Chinese also cannot mediate. The ASEAN tried, but I'm told, because I am on a day-to-day contact with the National Unity Government of Myanmar, NUG, which is the parallel government. They say we don't trust the ASEAN because many countries in ASEAN have a long tradition of military rule and they are soft on the Burmese military. Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand have long history of military rule, powerful militaries. So they say that the only country which can possibly mediate the conflict in Myanmar between the Tamadaw or the Burmese military on one hand and the democratic parties on the other and the ethnic rebel groups, these three major actors, is India. Because India has military to military relation with the Tamadaw. It has improved in recent years. We've also supplied some military hardware to them. We have very good connect with Aung San Suu Kyi and all the other political groups. So I have been saying, India, now you go to the MEA, they'll tell you, oh, we are waiting and watching. Waiting and watching is done only by people who either don't understand a problem or are too scared to get their hands, into the mud. You have to do, if India thinks India is a major power, we have to play a role in Myanmar. Because without Myanmar settling down, we can't have look east or act east. Forget about that. It's not geographically possible. So I am all for a Myanmar peace mission, and you send some of the senior leaders from Northeast. The Minister of State for External Affairs today is from Manipur, R.K. Ranjan Singh. You have Zoram Thanga, the Chief Minister of Mizoram, who knows the Burmese army, who knows the ethnic rebel groups, who knows Aung San Suu Kyi, and similar other figures like General Himalaya Singh, the Lieutenant General from Manipur, who just retired. Ambassador Raute from Mizoram, you have to send. The
Sir,
Chinese
two quick
actually use their frontier states like Yunnan for a lot of this trans-border diplomacy with neighboring countries. We should take a clue and do something on those lines and have a Myanmar peace mission. We can't turn our back and say, oh, we are waiting and watching. Waiting and watching, the excuse of the lazy.
two quick two quick points I want a reaction from you. One is the Islamist threat from Bangladesh, which are waiting to take over from our Sheikh Hasina, and they're just waiting to get into the power structure. Another, the Chinese influence in Bangladesh. These two quick points will wrap up the entire discussion today.
Well, as far as the Islamist threat is concerned, it's a real threat, because even at the peak of 1970 elections, which the Awami League swept and 168 seats in the 300-member Pakistan Assembly, even at that point of time, when Awami League completely swept the election, the Jamaat-e-Islami, which was pro-Pakistan and which, pitched for united Pakistan, they still had 12% of the popular vote. Even now, despite the Awami League victory, and the Awami League has been in power since January 2009, the Islamist vote, various different Islamist parties, 10 to 15%. And they are a violent minority. You would notice, Syed Saab, that in the last 2 years, these Islamist parties, I would call them an Islamist ecosystem in Bangladesh, have been on the streets continuously. First, they raised the issue of Sheikh Mujib's statue. Awami League was commissioning a lot of Sheikh Mujib statue because this is the centenary of Sheikh Mujib and 50th anniversary of their independence. They said, oh, statue, it's a very Hindu concept, it's an un-Islamic concept, we should build minar. Sheikh Hasina said, nothing doing. We'll have statues of my father, if there can be statues of Kamal Ataturk in Turkey, but there was a lot of disturbance. Then something happened in France, and the Islamists in Bangladesh get out the French embassy, created problems. Again, some tough policing, Hasina managed them. Then when Narendra Modi went to Bangladesh on the anniversary, Golden Jubilee anniversary of Bangladesh independence in March, again there was, very strong street agitation, again controlled by some tough policing. The trouble here is, and now again, our president is going for the Victory Day parade. I don't know, they may still create trouble. The trouble here is that when these Islamists, and now these Islamists are boosted by the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, they think the victory of the faith is inevitable, so they are creating problems. Hasina resorts to some very tough policing, and her argument is that these people are not amenable to reason, they only understand the danda. But then you have the Western human rights ecosystem, which says, oh, Hasina is turning Bangladesh into a police state. They begin to shed crocodile tears for these Islamists. Yeah, so that's a real threat. That's something that cannot be discounted. Sheikh
Yeah,
Hasina
quick
is
point on
aware of
China,
this.
sir. Quick point on China. We just closed thing.
The Chinese influence in Bangladesh has grown because the Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina historically distrusts the Americans. She thinks the CIA was involved in the 75 coup which killed her father. She depends on India, but Sheikh Hasina's basic line is, Heavy economic development will keep down these Islamist forces. If people have jobs, economic growth, they won't go for jihad. They won't go the Pakistan way. So therefore, but then India is not able to sustain that kind of infrastructure development in Bangladesh because we have our own economic limitations. And the limitations have grown over the COVID. So perforce she has turned to China and taking advantage of Bangladesh requirement for infrastructure finance, the Chinese have muscled their way in. They have huge projects there, and the way they are trying to infiltrate into different Bangladesh political parties, including the ruling party, is that they have a lot of business associates in China. They encourage them to go for elections. And you know how it goes. So you stand for elections, you do trade with us, you stand for election, and then you take care of our interests. It is through this mercantile
Okay,
route
just the time now for
primarily that
saying
the Chinese influences. Sorry.
thank you. So you just continue, sir. I mean, if the thing goes off, it's all thank you to everyone who is here. Yeah, continue.